Good evening, I'm Mike Rindo. It was about this time, 1 year ago, that it hit. A massive storm front packing hurricane-force winds moved across western Wisconsin, leaving behind a devastation unlike any the state has ever known. You could see it coming over rolling fields like these. Downsville farmer Wayne Thibodeau captured this breathtaking, if not frightening, photograph of the thunderhead as it swept over his farmland, making a direct beeline for Eau Claire. Weather experts called it a spearhead echo or huge downburst of winds, but those who lived through it will remember it simply as the storm.
The wind was just blowing like crazy. It blew the windows in the basement.
Every time they get thunderstorm warnings or tornado warnings, we get a little shaky now.
You don't have any control of it, you know? You end up thinking, well, man is still just man.
Tonight, NewsCenter 13 will take a look back at the July 15th, 1980 windstorm, its devastation and aftermath, and also bring you up to date on how the area has recovered from it.
The storm, 1 year later, brought to you by the Emergency and Trauma Center at Sacred Heart Hospital, Northern States Power Company, the Co-op Credit Union, Menard Incorporated, and Rinaldi Insurance.
Perhaps the most awesome aspect of the storm was its sheer size. The front that moved through here was more than 40 miles wide. It wreaked havoc on 4 western Wisconsin counties. Eau Claire, Dunn, Chippewa, and Pierce counties all suffered severe damage dealt out by blows of wind in excess of 100 miles per hour. But from what we could find, the most extensive damage appeared to be here at Eau Claire's Mill Run subdivision on the west side of the city. On the morning of July 16th, Mill Run looked like it had been hit by the equivalent of one of Mother Nature's roundhouse rights. NewsCenter 13's Jeff Welch was our reporter on the scene last year. Tonight he revisits Mill Run.
The destruction at Menard's Mill Run subdivision is perhaps the most haunting of windstorm damage. Flat ground and lack of trees made the area easy prey for high, slamming winds. More than 30 homes were ripped apart, leaving twisted lumber, furniture, personal belongings, and heaps of pink insulation carpeting the ground. After a brief tour of the area, Governor Lee Dreyfus said it looked like Okinawa. And from the air, this is what he saw. Surprisingly, no one was hurt, physically hurt anyway, though close calls were numerous. Barb Martinson and her young daughter just managed to get into the basement moments before their house started collapsing.
I was standing in the stairway. I was up the stairs first when the front window blew through, and I ran for the basement. I have a little girl, and I grabbed her and ran for the basement. And then I watched the roof blow off, and the walls just started falling down.
But every time you come back here, you see this, and you just, why?
Al Jordan was out of town when the winds came through. His was a tragic homecoming. Across the street, Roy Christie was fortunate. His house was battered instead of blown to bits. 77-year-old Roy said he pushed against the walls to keep them from caving in.
I was standing up against our sliding doors, patio doors, and I was pushing against them to keep them from coming in. And all at once was an awful crash in the house, and something from over here, I believe it was a rafter from one of the places, went right through my wife's bedroom. And the crash was so bad that it sounded just like maybe a cannon went off or something. And she started screaming, and I told her to go for the basement.
Since the windstorm a year ago, Al Jordan has moved away. So has Barb Martinson. In fact, many decided to leave this relatively flat, storm-vulnerable area, but not Roy Christie. He decided to stay and clean up, a process, he says, that took months.
Well, a good 2 months, you know, before I got everything back to order and got the yards all cleaned up, and then it took about another, maybe a month before they got the grass torn up in the back. It was replaced. And I spent most of the summer just digging insulation and plaster and lumber and everything out of the building in the back.
Today, a passerby wouldn't suspect this area was in shambles only months ago. The duplexes have been replaced and restored, stray lumber has been cleared, and the piles of pink insulation have been raked away. Folks here say that was the most painstaking task and still wince and cringe thinking about the pink menace overrunning everything. The storm still lives in memory, and stories of the morning after remain vivid.
We came out right after it happened, after the wind went down, and noticed that my camper that had blown over into the house next door, and that house was gone. So we went over and we heard them hollering, so we pulled the stuff out of the stairwell and helped them out and invited them to come over to my house because it still had a roof on it. And we went on down to the next house, and there was people in there, we got them out. Then we went on down.
So you were digging people out is what you were doing?
Yeah, we helped about 4 or 5 people out.
And one thing I'll tell you, I want to get in a plug for, and that's our Salvation Army. Boy, I'll never pass up a kiddo in my life. The first day they were out here in the first morning, and they had breakfast for us, hot coffee, and they were here every morning, all day, lunch, evening they had hot meals, and they wouldn't take a cent. I tried to pay them for it, nothing.
Dolores Cobbs was caught in a closet when the high winds came barreling through her home. Dolores says she held on for dear life while she was whirled inside the closet like a milkshake.
There's nothing like hanging onto a closet door and feel the closet going up and down, you know. It does something to you. I'd never do it again. Every time the wind would come, you'd kind of tighten up a little bit, and I think people ended up having a lot more respect for how can I say this right? For how ferocious weather can be, and you don't have any control of it, you know? You end up thinking, well, man is still just man. You can't do anything about something like this, and you pray you never have to go through it again. I know, just talking about it, I get all antsy.
Those who've remained at the Mill Run subdivision say they plan to stay. But like Dolores, it doesn't mean they're always comfortable about it.
Every time they get thunderstorm warnings or tornado warnings, we get a little shaky now.
Right.
Because really, this is kind of a tornado alley out here.
I was 77 years old when that one went through, and if I can last another one, it'd be pretty good.
The most concentrated damage may have occurred here at the Mill Run subdivision, but it was by no means limited to this area. Right across the road, for example, at the Menard shopping complex, there was heavy damage. Aerial photographs taken the morning after the storm best reveal the damage. Part of the roof was ripped off the Menard shopping center complex, and several other public buildings also lost roofs, including some Eau Claire schools. The damage has since been repaired. The storm cut a swath through Dunn and Pierce counties, uprooting trees, flipping over mobile homes, and ripping roofs off houses. The destruction spoke for itself. Final figures from the Red Cross testify to the widespread destruction. In the 4-county area, 52 homes were destroyed. Another 113 suffered major damage and 349 minor damage. 85 mobile homes were destroyed and 59 sustained major damage. 19 apartments destroyed, 18 major damage, and another 84 with minor damage. While most of the dwellings have been rebuilt or repaired, some still show the sting of the storm. Raymond and Sally Belden are just now rebuilding their home. It was moved off its foundation by the high winds. They managed to make it through the winter, but since May 10th, they've been living in their garage, so the house can't be completed. You've been waiting for months and months to rebuild your home. What took so long to do it?
Well, we had to wait for the insurance company to find settle, which took until November. And then by that time it was too late to try tearing down the house or anything, or otherwise we would have had to find an apartment or a motel or something, and it was too cold.
Belden's and many others were covered by private insurance, but some have had to rely on federal help. To date, 180 Small Business Administration loans totaling more than $1,114,000 have been approved, and another 169 Farmer Home Administration loans totaling more than $5,960,000 have been okayed. There's no doubt that property damage from the storm was incredible, but luckily, loss of life was minimal. One person died the night of the storm. 25-year-old Robin Young of the town of O'Galley in Dunn County was killed when her 70-foot mobile home flipped over. She was trying to rescue her 1-year-old son at the time. The morning of July 16th, power lines, hundreds of them, were on the ground or entangled in trees. 150,000 Northern States Power Company customers were without power, and for some, the blackout lasted 9 days. This is Northern State Power Company's 345 kilovolt power line serving western Wisconsin. It's the main artery bringing electricity to Eau Claire and surrounding area. But on the night of July 15th, 10 miles of this power line were knocked down by high winds. Rebuilding it and replacing several hundred other smaller lines proved to be an immense task. NewsCenter 13's Bill Hudson reports.
It's known as the backbone of NSP's electrical transmission system into Eau Claire, but sometime around 9:30 on this infamous July evening 1 year ago, the backbone was broken. 63 double-pole structures holding up 345,000 volts of power lie flat on the ground in a 10-mile stretch. Dispatchers at NSP's Systems Control knew the line kicked out the instant it happened. What they didn't know at the time was the extent of damage. NSP's Air Patrol would deliver the bad news.
I'm on the hill here about 360, and they're down as far to the west as the eye can see. Kind of expected maybe 2 or 3, maybe 4 at the most. There's 60 of them.
The 345 kV line would receive priority, being the major supplier of power to this area. A complete rebuild of the 10-mile stretch would be costly in time, money, and manpower. First estimates on a completion date put the line out of service for 2 months. $2.25 million would be the price tag. But sharp crews working non-stop would have power flowing in just 6 weeks. Still, NSP would be walking on thin ice until the completion, as other lines in the system wouldn't be able to handle the high voltages should demand again become heavy.
The electricity must flow over the lower voltage lines, and the problem with those lower voltage lines, they don't have as much capacity, and so they tend to overload. When they overload, our only choice is to start up our local generating plants that burn high-priced oil fuel. And we did do that for almost every weekday during the heavy load periods for the 6 weeks following the July 15th storm.
The 15th was hot and muggy, sure sign for high demand and heavy load. At NSP System Control in Eau Claire, where power flow is monitored, dispatchers followed the progression of outages throughout the evening. When it was over, not only had the 345 line tripped out, but many other lower voltage transmission lines and miles of distribution feeders throughout the path of the storm lie a tangled mess.
And about 7:30 in the evening is when our transmission lines started tripping over in the western area. And in telephone calls over there, we found out that they had a severe storm in the area, moving pretty fast. So I started calling in some extra help because I knew we'd have to have some help here.
In the computer, it alarm sounds, and then we get a printed readout at hard copy. And that night, that thing started printing, and of course you couldn't begin to read it. After it was all over with, I mean, it was spitting out paper faster than anybody could comprehend what was going on. And when it was all over with, then we had to go to each individual sub and see what we had out and which lines were in and so forth. And there were, like we said before, there were none in service except one.
When such widespread damage occurs to a system as large as NSP's, the question is where to begin. How do you piece together this electrical network that took years to build? Distribution Superintendent Stan Redunzel gives direction.
The first thing, of course, they would do as they went out into the area that they were assigned to was to make sure that there wasn't any energized conductors laying down on the ground that could be a hazard. After that was determined and the area was secured, and of course in most places there wasn't anything, it was all down. The next thing would be to tree damage, what they had to get off of the wire so that they could start putting that back up. If there were poles broken, call back to say what they needed as far as poles, transformers, what they would need there. Start putting that back up then, and so that we could get that area, at least the primary section of it, ready to go. And
Damage was also heavy to other parts of NSP's West District. Elmwood and Menominee would require attention from line crews clearing trees, setting new poles, and stringing conductor.
We had crews from Wisconsin Power and Light out of Fond du Lac. We had crews from Wisconsin Public Service out of Green Bay and out of Wausau. We dispatched part of those crews out to the Elmwood, Spring Valley area. Then we started putting our feeders back together, trying to get the main sections of Menominee back on.
How many hours did you spend at work a day, and for how long?
Oh, I suppose it was 18 hours, 16, 18 hours for, well, I guess we worked from 4 or 5 days, and then we got called back to, we had a storm down in Vroke, we had to go back there and work, so I guess it's 6, 7 days altogether we worked.
In the ensuing 8 days, no employee would be spared work. Everyone would be utilized in the effort of piecing the system back together, restoring power to the 150,000 customers in the affected area. More than 300 people were involved with everything from climbing poles and clearing trees to finding food and answering phones.
I assisted Ron Sandvig in that it was his chief responsibility, but I filled in wherever we could because of the number of calls coming in and the time period. You couldn't take it for that number of hours.
You were glad to get home at night. We normally got home at midnight, and the time you took a bath and got in bed, you had to be back at 5. You were tired, but when you put somebody in power, it made it all worth it, I guess.
Yeah. Repair meant the ordering of thousands of feet of conductor, hundreds of lightning arresters, transformers, poles, and crossarms. Suppliers throughout the region remained open to NSP just to keep the flow of materials constant. NSP stores and warehouses would become a beehive of activity, working right along with crews' needs, keeping shipments coming in, supplies going out. Materials wouldn't run short until the final few days of the outage, and by this time, service to most customers was restored. But after 6 or 7 days without power, some had reached the ends of their ropes and went to NSP to vent their frustrations. But for the most part,
you get very edgy when you don't have power for that long. You can't take a hot shower, let alone cook your food and keep your freezer cold. So I think probably you would anticipate that people would be even a little more irritable than they were.
In the final analysis, repair to the system totaled over $4 million. Replacing 10 miles of 345 line accounted for more than half that amount. Not included in the total figure is income lost from sales and high oil costs for running the Wheaton plant. Parts of the total figure will be written off over a period of time, plus sharing expenses in the rate structure throughout the entire NSP system. One last thought, NSP had no insurance agent to call that morning after.
The power outage caused major inconveniences for area residents. No lights, no refrigeration, no stoves to cook hot food on. That's where area charity organizations came in. The morning after the storm struck, the Salvation Army was out providing hot coffee and food to storm victims. And then, of course, there was the Red Cross. A total of $78,000 was spent by the Red Cross helping storm victims. A variety of services were provided. For example, 2 truckloads of dry ice were trucked in to help residents keep food cold in 90-degree temperatures. Families who had their homes damaged or destroyed were put up in motels. Groceries were provided for those who lost all their food to spoilage. And then there was the Red Cross meal program.
Being without electricity and power in so many of the situations, mobile vans went out into the area to bring food to the individuals. And then after several days, a meal situation was set up at North High School where individuals could come in to get 3 meals a day if necessary.
But if a similar storm were to hit the area tomorrow, the local Red Cross would not have any money budgeted for it, mainly because it doesn't have the resources and because the National Red Cross provides funds in such cases of emergency.
Our local funding could not begin to take care of a disaster of that magnitude, and it would be impossible to budget for that sort of thing because some years there may not be any necessity at all for it, that scale, of course, and hopefully we won't have need for it again for years and years or ever.
Trees. Western Wisconsin is blessed with an abundance of them. In fact, much of the city of Eau Claire could go undetected because of the tree cover. Only an occasional building jutting out of the leafy blanket lends evidence to the city below. Tens of thousands of trees, public and private, were lost to storm winds in the city of Eau Claire alone. Today only stumps remain of what were once majestic shade trees. The destruction of numerous trees in western Wisconsin was certainly one of the major aspects of the July 15th windstorm, something that almost everyone experienced. Eau Claire City Manager Steve Atkins probably described it best.
Just like the vegetation of the city had been, somebody had reached down and just yanked it up by the roots.
The morning after the storm, the task of clearing trees from streets and rooftops began, and for weeks afterwards, the buzz of chainsaws permeated the streets of Eau Claire. Today, an occasional chainsaw can still be heard as city forestry crews cut down trees damaged by the winds and go about the business of replanting trees.
The work we're still doing is on a daily basis. We're still answering calls from people who have hazardous limbs, hazardous trees, split trees. These calls come in almost on a daily basis, especially after a rainstorm or some heavy wind.
What about replanting trees, Rod? Is there going to be any of that done?
At the present time, we're looking at replacing the trees on the boulevards and the parks, two separate programs. The ones on the boulevard, the trees that were torn from the ground, should receive federal reimbursement. And we're presently developing a program whereby we would offer a rebate of 100% to anybody who wished to replant a tree that was torn from the ground. In the parks, these trees are being replanted both by donations from service clubs and also by federal funding, and we should be getting to that also in 1982.
While minor tree cleanup continues in Eau Claire today, in outlying areas there's a great deal of work still to be done. Lumbermen here are working to clear an oak tree stand heavily damaged by the winds. Why is it taking so long? A summary of tree damage in the area best explains. The Department of Natural Resources estimates 56.5 million board feet of saw timber was lost in the storm, along with 250,000 cords of pulpwood. Timber losses in terms of money amounted to $5 million. Dennis Hofelder is the DNR forester in charge of storm timber removal and replacement in the Eau Claire, Chippewa Falls area.
The storm as a whole did quite a bit of damage throughout the area, and the cleanup is going to continue for, maybe some 2 to 3 years yet.
What about reseeding and having these trees replaced? Will that be a natural process? Is there going to be some planting going on?
For the most part, Mike, it will be a natural process. The oak, which is the primary species here, is going to be reestablishing itself. In cases where we have pine that have been blown down and the area needs to be reestablished, we'll probably be planting trees.
This is the way a clearing job looks in progress, but it doesn't take long after for the woods to hide storm scars. This 80-acre patch of woods was cleared of storm downs late last winter, and already nature has healed itself to a great degree. Since the storm hit, 230 timber sales like the ones we've seen have been set up, and 185 have been sold to date. Those sold involve more than 13 million board feet of saw timber and some 20,000 cords of pulpwood. It's in agricultural areas where reminders of the storm are still most evident today. Huge pieces of metal, mangled by the storm's 100-mile-per-hour winds, can still be seen strewn across the countryside. Buildings knocked down in the storm last year still haven't been replaced in many cases, and farmers have received little financial aid to recover their losses. Gary West was our initial reporter on agricultural damage last year. Tonight he updates us on the situation.
Damage to farms in the 4 hardest-hit counties defies description. Barns that have successfully battled the weather, some for more than 100 years, lost this war. Farmers whose existence has always depended greatly on the weather donned flashlights and courage and stepped out of their basements early Wednesday, many of them finding their barns laying in ruins. And that was just the beginning. Their animals had no basement in which to seek shelter, and many lost their lives. Joe Osmond lost 2 barns, one of them collapsing on some livestock.
Well, we had 21 head in this barn here, and there's 8 of them dead. We got the rest of them out. There's 3 that are still crippled, and we don't know what the outcome of them will be.
At the very least, more than 10,000 farms were left without electrical power and no hope of getting it back for days. When power is lost, water pumps don't run and milking equipment is silent. Both critical situations. It's impossible to milk a large herd by hand, and animals can't last more than 12 hours without water. The Department of Natural Resources pitched in, using fire control trucks to haul water to Dunn County farms. Many farmers hooked up generators capable of handling their milking systems, one generator often being shared by a number of farms. National Guard and DNR generators were also brought in, 130 in all. It will be years before the countryside looks normal again. It may never look the way it did before the storm.
The storm hasn't ended in rural areas of western Wisconsin. Much of the devastation it brought is not yet a memory. It's still here.
A year later, the countryside is marked with battered barns, crumpled siding from once valued pole sheds, and other reminders like this chopper wagon. They stand almost as monuments to that ruinous night 1 year ago. This is Dunn County. By all estimates, farm damage was worse here than in any other county hit by the storm. Federal estimates suggest that $27 million worth of damage was done just to farm buildings in Dunn County. And the county ASES administrator says the damage was further complicated by promises of federal aid. Promises that fell apart like just another barn in the storm.
So he just had to go out on his own and at the private banks or PCA or Federal Land Bank or wherever and get the money. And the bad thing there was they had insurance for $40,000. It cost them $100,000 probably to rebuild, and the big interest at 15 or 17% interest, which really hurt the farmers.
So he really did not end up getting much federal help at all?
Federal help was very, very little, yes.
Okay. Did that lead to frustration?
Very much so. A lot of frustration.
In the end, the Farmers Home Administration came through with $2.5 million worth of low-interest loans for Dunn County farmers, and that's all the federal help the farming community received, less than 10% of damage estimates. Damage was also done to crops, $8 million worth of damage in Dunn County alone. Again, there was virtually no federal aid.
Well, I think the financial problems occurred, of course, when the farmer had to purchase the forage and the feedstuffs to replace that he lost with the high interest rates and lack of financial resources. Of course, this is where the problem occurred.
Lost milk checks, too.
No doubt about it. There was quite a few milk checks that were lost. The generators that they borrowed in many cases were enough to handle the milking machine unit, but couldn't also handle the cooling unit that's on the bulk tank. And it became a case of which do we do? And of course the final answer was we milk the cows and dump the milk.
But weather-related losses are nothing new to farmers, and Summerfield says, all things considered, most farmers survived quite well.
I always maintain that the farmer is a rather ingenious individual, and if he's left to his own resources, will figure something out. And even though he was inconvenienced, most of them had the resources, lined up generators, lined up whatever facilities they needed, borrowed a barn someplace, and really, while they were inconvenienced and did have problems, I think that they came through quite well.
If there can be a positive result from the storm, it is that farmers are better prepared for severe weather.
I think every farmer keeps his eye on every black cloud that appears in the sky, kind of wondering. As far as preparedness, I think there are also more generators in the area. I think most farmers have acquired some sort of alternative power source. I think would probably be the main way they're prepared.
There is no question the storm was the most furious display of natural violence most of us will ever see. A repeat performance here is unlikely. but the farmer who lived through it will probably recall that storm back in July of 1980 every time he hears the thunder of an impending storm.
The night of July 15th, Eau Claire's communications center is flooded with reports of damage, power outages, and more heavy weather on the way. City officials acted quickly to declare a state of emergency and enact a curfew. Things worked smoothly, even though the city had no formal disaster plan. Hypothetical. What if a storm the size of last July's were to hit Eau Claire tomorrow? Would emergency government leaders be prepared? For years, the state of Wisconsin has had such emergency declaration policies. But until last year, nothing of that magnitude had ever hit the city of Eau Claire. So the question is, have Eau Claire city leaders developed a formal disaster declaration policy, one that would handle situations like last July 15th's windstorm?
I have a file that I kept during that whole process, and as far as a plan, I know what has to be done, and a lot of that you have to carry around in your head. It's not something that you can read a textbook to approach, but you know, we have worked out fairly well. We know what has to be done with the immediate things that have to be done.
But while the state and local government appear to have a relatively clear-cut disaster policy, the federal government's is a bit cloudy, especially the disaster funding part. You may recall right after the July windstorm, there was a controversy involving state and federal officials over how much the federal government would pay to cover storm damage. Well, that controversy continues today. Randy Luby brings us the story.
In the end, it comes down to money. Who's going to pay the bill? For the people who lost their homes, farm buildings, or crops, the losses should be covered by insurance. But what about the public cost? The estimated $3.5 million spent by cities and counties to clear streets, to pay workers, to repair the damage to city or county property that you pay taxes on.
That's covered, in a way, by an insurance policy, too. When President Carter declared the 4 counties a disaster area, it freed up assistance money from the federal government. In other words, some of the tax money that you've been paying the federal government for years would now be funneled back home again to help you out during your time of need. In essence, cashing in on an insurance policy that you've been paying premiums on for years. Well, it didn't work out that way.
The storm caused more than $3 million worth of public damage. Damage that the federal government recognized as eligible. Everyone from the county official to Governor Dreyfus thought that meant the federal government would pay $3.3 million. Not so. Federal officials said they weren't going to pay all of the cost, just 75% of it. That left $817,000 unpaid, and an angry group of local and state officials who claimed the federal government was gypping them.
Because to me, I saw it as the people of the state of Wisconsin have been paying insurance all this time to help take care of these natural disasters elsewhere. And it's like any other insurance. You're glad when you don't collect because you don't want that automobile crash or your house to burn or whatever. And now it came our turn to collect, and bang, they said, oh no, we're only paying 75%. That's what I was objecting to. I thought they were welching.
It caused a storm of protest. Local leaders met with Federal Emergency Management Agency officials. The locals screamed foul, but the feds held their ground.
I wouldn't use the word deviation. I would say that this policy has evolved over the last year or so based on presidential directive, and I don't think you can go much higher than that.
But if the policy was being changed, as Wehner said, someone forgot to notify the states.
My objection then as to what happened on the Eau Claire disaster and that 4-county disaster area was that that was being discussed in the Congress, but the Congress hadn't decided any change at all. A group of bureaucrats decided to change the rules. And the reason they could get away with it is that the law, as it now stands, says the federal government will pay up to 100%.
We felt, and when I say we, all the way up through the governor, that they should have, first of all, informed us and informed all the states that they were going to implement such a policy as 75-25.
Why did the federal government change the policy? Here's one possible reason: the influx of Cubans into the country. President Carter did not give the Cubans refugee status. That meant the money used to take care of them came out of the Emergency Management Fund, the same fund used to handle disasters like the July 15th storm.
Between the Cuban refugee situation and the Mount St. Helens problem, the federal government certainly did have problems with their total budget. There's no doubt about it. This impacted on the budget. The Cuban situation reflected on it because the money for the Cubans, nearly $500 million nationally, was taken from the President's Disaster Declaration Fund, which was rather unprecedented. It should have come from immigration funding. It should have been a special appropriation by Congress, but not handled in the way that it was. And this also affected the Eau Claire situation.
Not only that, but 1980 was a year of disasters.
You talk about the floods in western Pennsylvania, Mount St. Helens, the Cuban situation, the hurricanes that we had, the severe tornado in Grand Island, and then the Eau Claire problem nationally. You've got some key serious disasters.
If all of this wasn't bad enough, the July 15th storm became a political issue too. 1980 was an election year, and politicians were flocking to the four-county area. Republicans were preaching the heartlessness of the Carter administration for not giving full funding, while Democrats did their best to defend the president. One politician went so far as to hold a news conference in front of a house in Eau Claire, a house that had been split in half by a fallen tree.
I've learned that it's very difficult to deal with the federal government in an election year. There's no doubt about the behind-the-scenes efforts, the literally deals that are being made on, I need these votes in this committee, I'll give you this much money in this kind of situation. The power of the federal government in an election year is something that, unless you deal with it, and certainly before I dealt with it, I was just not aware of the amount of finagling that goes on behind the scenes.
When the whole disagreement came about as to 75 versus 100% on those certain aids, we had been listening to our emergency government people saying that, okay, these were recoverable costs. So if you expend this money, you're going to get 100% back from the federal government. Well, then all of a sudden we find out, no, we're only going to get 75%. Then we had Congressman Balda saying this, Senator Nelson saying this, Senator Proxmire looking into the problem, and we had the lack of communication.
Assemblyman Richard Shoemaker's district was especially hard hit. Now, looking ahead, Shoemaker is drawing up legislation that would avoid similar funding problems.
And I guess briefly why is having to do with the problems that disaster victims must face immediately after the disaster. Some may have lost their homes, loved ones, businesses. Certainly the economics of the area and the economy of the area is going to be hurting for a great period of time. And to lump on top of that the additional costs, I think is asking those people to carry a burden that is a little heavy. And what I'm saying is that when a disaster affects an area of a county or 2 counties or 4 counties or 5 counties, it will in effect hurt the whole state. And it affects the whole state. So the state ought to be involved.
Shoemaker is trying to push through the legislature a bill that would require the state to pay some money to local governments in the event of a disaster, something Shoemaker and Governor Dreyfus disagree on.
I am concerned that what Mr. Shoemaker is proposing, you know, they hear about that in Washington and say, well, see, we don't have to keep this fund and support local disaster, because if we don't, anything we don't pay for the locals, the states will vote through their legislature and pay it anyway. It's a bad signal.
I guess I disagree with that. Federal government has never used that, and I say never in my experience used that, because it just seems that no matter what the federal government takes up, there is at least 1 to maybe 15 states that have already addressed that problem. And the feds rarely say, well, we're going to provide this program to all the states except those that already have it.
There is a footnote to this story. State and local officials were so upset with the way the federal government handled the disaster question that the General Accounting Office in Washington is conducting a special investigation, the results of which should be known by the end of this month. The only thing that can be done now is to make sure the same problems don't surface again the next time a disaster hits, and hope that that disaster doesn't occur during an election year.
While we do have exact figures on how much money the federal government has paid out to date in disaster funding, private insurance figures are a bit harder to get a handle on. From what we've been able to gather, 7,500 claims have been settled, totaling about $5 million. But that's only major insurance companies and only in the city of Eau Claire, and not even all of their figures are complete yet. Most western Wisconsin residents went through normal channels to settle their insurance claims following the July 15th storm. But for some, that wasn't the case. The story of the Martel Mutual Insurance Company became a major one stemming from the storm. Tonight, Karen Passler updates us.
Martel Town Mutual Insurance Company, based in Baldwin, was one of the state's largest town mutuals. It covered 3,200 policyholders in a 4-county area. Before the storm came, Martel was having some minor financial difficulties. So the State Insurance Commission decided Martel policyholders would have to pay assessments, totaling $275,000.
The reason that we came about with our first assessment, and unfortunately and coincidentally, I guess it came the same day as the July 15th storm hit, was due to the fact that in the year of 1979 we had a terrific amount of loss. And in order to build our surplus up in a relatively quick hurry, we figured this was the best route to travel.
It was the first assessment in Martel's 103-year history, and for people like Larry Zeal, who owns this Dunn County farm. Then the windstorm came. It swept through Zeal's farm, leaving about $67,000 in damages behind.
Okay, now when the assessment, or the appraiser come out and appraised it, there was parts down on the barn roof, windows in the house, some on the roof, some doors inside the house ripped right off, the one pole shed, the tops off the silo, I think 6 or 7 wagons destroyed, chopper box, etc. They come out with something like around $67,000 worth of damage at the time.
Zeal was one of some 1,200 Martel policyholders with windstorm damage claims that totaled just over $5 million. The State Insurance Commission decided Martel would not be able to cover the damage claims and should be placed in liquidation.
We sent a financial examiner and a CPA firm into the company to assess the total amount of losses. And they quickly determined that losses were much greater in the range of a $2.5 million deficit. And when that extent of the loss was known, we decided there was no alternative but to liquidate.
In late August, Gary Bakke, a New Richmond attorney, was appointed liquidator. Bakke says he discovered Martel could cover about half of the damage claims, but that left another $2.5 million. So policyholders were called upon to pay a second assessment. Jack Hines believes the decision to liquidate Martel was made too hastily.
I, in my own mind, felt, and we as a board of directors felt, that we could have rectified the situation once we found out that there was a problem. If we had a legal hassle, we as a board of directors, I'm sure, could have taken care of it. The assessment that the liquidators had for our policyholders could have been levied the same as if the board of directors had done it. And I feel that many of our policyholders wouldn't be as bitter as they are today if they could have still had their company.
But Hefty disagrees.
You don't feel that it was done too hastily, the liquidation process?
No, definitely not. We had explored the other alternatives. We had asked the company management to explore the other alternatives, and no one was interested in providing funds even at the $1 million range, and therefore it seemed impossible that the $2.5 million could be raised.
The thing of it is, the concept of a town mutual, boils down to that fact, because years ago when they first organized town mutuals, if they didn't have any losses, there were no premiums. A bunch of farmers or a group of farmers got together and started Martel, and they all said, well, if you have a loss or sustain a loss, we'll all chip in and pay for it. And that's basically the same thing that's happening now, only it's 103 years later. And a much larger loss, a much larger company, too, as far as that's concerned.
Part of the reason the state decided to liquidate was the company's reinsurance policies. State statute requires town mutuals to buy their own insurance to protect themselves against major losses. The commission had approved Martel's reinsurance policies.
The reinsurance that Martel Mutual had recently purchased was a very complicated set of 4 reinsurance contracts, interrelated. when people started looking carefully at these contracts after the storm, it became obvious that they were inadequate, and that they were inadequate by somewhere between $2 and $3 million. And that's the basic cause of the problem.
Hines says his company was under the impression the policies were all right.
And according to the letter that we received from the insurance department, that they approved it. And so we were under the impression that this is the policy that the state statutes wanted.
But Bakke says it was discovered after the windstorm that the reinsurance was not adequate, and he says the state agrees.
The company obtained new reinsurance in 1978. They previously had reinsurance which complied with the administrative rules. The 1978 contract did not comply. It was submitted to the department for approval, and it was approved in error at that time. It was a mistake for the company, the board of directors, the reinsurers, and the department. The administrative rule sets guidelines that companies are to follow. And like a case of speeding, it was a violation even though it wasn't caught at that time. But the department bears some responsibility for making that error as well.
At any rate, the policyholders, like Larry Zeal, faced a second assessment. Bakke says most of the assessments have been paid. One was as high as $37,000. The assessment money covered the damage claims, and nearly all of them have been paid. Zeal was able to rebuild most of his lost property. One barn is still down. But the policyholders have filed a $3 million lawsuit. Defendants named in the suit include the State Insurance Commissioner's Office, officers of Martel, and the reinsurance companies.
The proceeds of that lawsuit will be used to refund the assessments. Now, the attorney representing Martel, or the attorneys representing Martel Mutual, are from Eau Claire, Roy Wilcox and Arnie Anderson. That's going to be a long, complicated lawsuit that they're involved in, and it's just getting started. It'll take years. But any proceeds that they recover from that lawsuit will be paid to me and will be then refunded pro rata to those people who've paid their assessments.
Meantime, Zeal and many other farmers are hoping they can continue rebuilding their farms.
Oh, it'll take me probably 5 years if I have good crops and stuff to pull it back out, at least. If everything's ideal weather, etc., which is by book, that's theoretically possible, but not probable.
The story of Martel Town Mutual Insurance Company is far from over. Nearly all the windstorm damage claims have been paid back, and nearly all the assessments have been paid. But until the lawsuit is settled, we won't know if the policyholders will receive the refund on their insurance premiums or a refund on that second assessment. And that lawsuit could take years.
It's possible, but not probable, that a storm the intensity of last July's could hit this area again. Meteorologist Joe D'Andrea is here to explain a little bit about the ingredients that go into a storm like that. This is the photo we've been showing you throughout the program. Could you tell us a little bit about what it is? It's not a tornado.
Oh, no, Mike, it's not a tornado at all. Actually, what it is the leading edge of that very severe thunderstorm. We call this cloud line here the gust front of the thunderstorm, and what that is the cold air rushing down because of the rain cooling it. You can see the rain actually pouring down here. Here's the horizon, the trees, etc., and then the sky. This is the leading edge of that thunderstorm as it pushed across western Wisconsin, of course, with that downrush of cold air moving out ahead of it up to 100 to 120 miles an hour.
Called a downburst. Are those pretty common to our area?
It turns out, yes, in fact, they are, Mike. This is something that meteorologists and others have just begun to recognize as a special weather phenomenon similar to a tornado, and it seems to be pretty common across Wisconsin, Illinois, Minnesota, and Michigan. These states seem to have the most downbursts, although they're not common occurrence by any means, but of course we look back at the July 1977 storm up in the Phillips area, too.
What about last July's windstorm in the Eau Claire area? How did that develop over the day?
Okay, we've got a couple of maps, Mike, we can show you now, and just how that storm did develop. Actually, it wasn't a real severe situation as it started out. We had a weak area of low pressure over the eastern part of South Dakota. This is the way it looked at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. But notice the warm front extending from southwestern Minnesota into eastern Iowa. Ahead of the warm front, we had very dry air, also very warm air. 92 degrees at 2 o'clock in Eau Claire, 94 in the Twin Cities. South of the front, then, very humid air with with temperatures in the upper 80s and 90s. What happened then, this warm front began to move into the drier air, pulling up that moisture air over it, and the result was some pretty severe weather. As I said, this was a weak low pressure area, so although we knew thunderstorms were possible, we really didn't expect it to happen at that severe anyway. The 10 p.m. conditions, though, showed it all came together over western Wisconsin. As a matter of fact, that low pressure area at 10 o'clock tracked right over the Eau Claire area, pulling the cold front behind with it. You can see the humid air streaming up ahead of it. We were right at the confluence, right at the center of the low pressure area, and that's why the thunderstorm activity became so severe across western Wisconsin. It just happened to be a one-shot deal right there in the western part of the state. The radar laps we have also to show you, which starting out about just after the 6 o'clock news on July 15th, 1980, we had a band of thunderstorms developing across Minnesota. You can see the line. It wasn't exceptionally severe, although some downbursts were beginning to occur in isolated areas in eastern Minnesota. And you can watch how this line of thunderstorms organizes itself as it moves into western Wisconsin. We start to see the typical spearhead echo now just beginning to take shape. Here's that spearhead echo. We see this curving or bowhead or spearhead shape to it, and right at the top of that echo, right at the center of that echo, is where we usually see the most severe activity, and that's what moved right through the Eau Claire area. This is the last picture we had before the storm, of course, blew all the power out all across the area. But this is a very isolated incidence of that severe weather. It then continued on eastward across most of central and southeast Wisconsin. Actually, Mike, that storm continued right on into the eastern part of Michigan, into the Detroit area. So quite a line of storms.
Sky watching. We've all been doing a little more of that since the July 15th windstorm. Whenever a menacing cloud approaches or the wind begins howling, many of us scurry to our radio or television to check to see if any severe weather is in the offing. You can call it paranoia or just plain caution, but what it boils down to is a respect for nature, knowing that even with all of man's technological advances, we're still at the mercy of the elements, unable to harness the weather. I guess that's the real lesson behind the July 15th windstorm, that something like that can strike at any time. Let's hope it never happens again. Thank you for joining us. Good night.
The Storm, 1 year later, was brought to you by the Emergency and Trauma Center at Sacred Heart Hospital, Northern States Power Company, the Co-op Credit Union, Menard Incorporated, and Rinaldi Insurance.